Today, we are going to be speaking with Amanda Knox. After spending nearly 4 years in an Italian prison for a murder she didn't commit, Amanda's now an exoneree, a journalist, an author, and also host of the podcast Hard Knocks with Amanda Knox. Her newest book is Free, My Search for Meaning. This is so great. I really appreciate you being on today.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm glad we could bond over the mutual uh, journey that is parenthood for a
Parenthood,
second there
yeah.
before we came on.
So, you've done so many interviews and the documentaries, and it feels as though so much of your experience has been asked about, it's been said. And so I'm a little more curious now that there's sort of some more distance from it. And you're obviously not living in Italy anymore, and you're doing different things, you're a parent, etc. To what degree, let's maybe start like on the public side. To what degree do you bump into people who have things they want to say to you, maybe not necessarily supportive things, or like to what degree is this still like you step out of the house and the experience in Italy is very present?
It's very present, yeah. And I would say that the vast majority of the time, especially if I encounter someone in person, it's usually a positive experience. There's somebody who has followed the case, who really cared about it back in the day, and suddenly they encounter me and they're like, "Oh my God, here's this person that I feel like I know," and I feel a lot of people really got emotionally invested in this story, not just because it's a very emotional story, but also because the way that the media sort of crafted the narrative, it made it a very compelling story and one that really like drew people in. And so I find very, very often that people, when they encounter me, they have very strong feelings about me and about what happened to me, and they want to tell me about it, which is great and which is fine because that's all actually interesting stuff for me at this point in my life to help me process. Like, you're right, there's been a lot of coverage of what happened in this case, or at least like certain aspects of what happened in this case. I would
Yeah.
argue that other things about the case were not covered as broadly, and that was because they did not fit the clickbait material. Like, just even the fact that the actual person who murdered my roommate is on trial today for sexually assaulting another young woman since getting out of prison, that's not being covered very much out there in the world because it doesn't fit that narrative that was so scandalous and so clickbaity. You're so to say that like there are certain aspects of this case, especially people's intrigue with my like the accusation of my involvement in this. Uh, it's true that it's been covered a lot. I have found, though, that there's a difference between talking about the gruesome facts of what happened and talking about what does it mean about what happened? What sort of lessons can we learn from this case? What lessons can I learn personally? What lessons can we learn collectively? And I've really sort of settled also into what personal things I learned from this experience that are not just personal to me, but are actually universal, right? Like the thing that I went through was very extreme and not something that people typically go through in their lives. However, everyone goes through something in their life. That the realities of their lived experience do not live up to their expectations or hopes or dreams, and they are suddenly slammed with some kind of existential crisis that they have to work through. And I know just from seeing other people and almost having been broken myself that that experience can break you. And I wish as a young person that I had had more tools to help me understand what was happening to me in the moment, to help me get to the place that I am today, which is a person who is settled, who is self aware, who feels like I am a valuable and effective member of society, and who is not going to be re victimized again because of how I was victimized in the first place.
Sometimes I will read, in preparing for the interview, these ideas of, oh, if everything had been the same, but Amanda had spoken better Italian at the time, the
Yeah.
situation never would have gone where it did. Or If
Mm,
Amanda had been a man, the entire dynamics of the situation would have been different, or
totally.
whatever, right? These like
Mhm,
characteristic differences.
mhm.
You having been the person who went through all this, and I'm sure has sort of gone over all of the different possibilities many times. Do you think that there's anything to those or other ideas? If your age had been different, if you had been a 45-year-old woman at the time, then the entire thing would have been different. Does any
Mhm.
of that ring true in any way?
It rings true in the sense that what happened was a kind of perfect storm. Like for the moment in time that it was, 2007 all the way to 2015, which is when the actual murder trial was definitively resolved.
Yep.
Like that period of time, culturally, internationally, there were certain aspects about this case that just checked all of these boxes in the perfectly horrible way that it became the perfect storm that it was. And I also think, if my prosecutor had been a different person, if the like another, I think a lot of focus has been put on me and what if I were different in some way, what would have happened. But I also like to turn the lens around and say, well, what if the people who had actual agency and who were, law enforcement professionals, if they had been
Right.
different? Like, what if, actually something that my prosecutor, I don't know if you already know this, probably from having read Free, but I have a relationship now with my prosecutor. We correspond back and forth.
Yep.
We have, it's hard to call it a friendship, but it's certainly a relationship of like mutual understanding and respect at this point. And one thing that even he has acknowledged is that in Italy there are different, levels of police who have different training and different expertise. And had the Carabinieri been involved in investigating the case instead of the Polizia Postale, that also would have completely changed the way that this case was investigated and prosecuted. So,
That's really
yeah.
interesting. I'm from Argentina, and it's a
Mhm.
very similar thing where there are
Mm.
cases where you've got your city police, your provincial police, the carabinieri, the equivalent,
Mhm.
and the trajectory of these things, it sort of takes on a life of its own in a way by virtue of which agency is gets involved at the beginning.
Exactly. Yeah, and what the, priorities of that agency are, what the expertise or, what's the power structure within that. Like all of these like human elements really play a huge role in how justice is served, right? Like, I think one of my big lessons about this that I take away is that we have this idea that the institution of justice is this sort of like sacred, symbolic mechanism that we can just put our faith into.
Yep.
But really, it's just a bunch of people. It's a bunch of people making decisions that may or may not be within the law technically, and the results are what it is. And so like it's less predictable and less reliable than we'd like to think it is. And that's, I think, a major lesson for all of us, just as like global and even local citizens, to really appreciate that the institutions that we are taught to believe in
Mhm.
are are human ultimately and therefore fallible in all of these myriad ways.
One of the things that you see, for example, if you look on YouTube at videos about false confessions, where they bring together like a defense attorney and an interrogator and they talk about this, in the comments, you always see versions of would never happen to me, just would never happen to me. There's no circumstance in which I would find myself where I would say, yeah, maybe I did, or yes, I did, if it weren't true. And
Right.
I think like personally, I both understand that feeling, but as someone who's never been in that situation, I also assume there are things that you only feel when you are in that situation. So
Yeah.
can you talk a little bit about, being lied to, sleep deprivation, food denial, all this stuff? Like how can you describe the total of what ends up happening in that situation that changes what you're willing to say?
Sure. And just now that you are mentioning, especially like just the comments section of it all, right? Like, there seems to be a very strong reaction. It's not just like, oh, false confessions are a thing and people go, oh, interesting. Like there's a sort of like really strong defensive mechanism that comes in. It sort of, to me, sounds like the lady doth protest too much. Like
Mm,
I think the very idea that someone could be compelled or coerced to implicate themselves in a crime that would land them in prison for the rest of their life or on death row is such a scary idea that I feel like we almost automatically reject it out of hand because we think no, just no, like no, I can't, like we can't go there. I
yeah.
won't. I would, that would never happen to me. And it's not because that's coming from an informed place. It's coming from a place of fear. Um, and it should come from a place of fear because
It's
it's a
terrifying.
terrifying experience.
Yeah.
It was the worst experience of my life, of the entire ordeal. That night, when I am 20 years old and being screamed at and lied to and deprived of sleep and deprived of food and deprived of water, like having all of my basic needs just unmet and used against me, like that, by authority figures that I had been raised to trust, in a context where I was already in shock and psychologically vulnerable because of the sudden and gruesome death of one of the people I was living with in my own house. Like all of that played a role in making me vulnerable to suggestion, to manipulation, to gaslighting. And I mean, if you look at the cases, and I have looked at the cases because for the longest time, I did not even understand what had happened to me in my interrogation. It was so psychologically disturbing and confusing to be sort of led, like strung along and beaten along to believe something that is not true. Like that, it was like there's actually an interesting parallel. I don't know if you've ever spoken to anyone who is a specialist in extremism and how people are,
Many, many,
yeah,
many, many. Yeah.
one of the things that they talk about is that ideologies or new ideas, extreme ideas, are more easily implanted in a person who has gone through some kind of shock or has gone through some kind of loss or is experiencing grief. They're suddenly the sort of like normal thing about their life has been disrupted. And then it is at that moment that an ideology or an idea or some kind of suggestion is more easily able to enter into the mind of the most, stout believer in, democracy suddenly becomes an extremist. Like
Yeah.
it's a similar thing that happens at a very fast pace when you are a single person who, doesn't have to be young, although I was young, doesn't have to be speaking a foreign language, although I was speaking a foreign language. Like there are all these things that made me more vulnerable, but even a person who is like totally fit, an adult, like a grown man can be led to believe things that are not true because of a series of steps that police are even to this day legally allowed to do in interrogations rooms without consequence, that will coerce an innocent person to confess. And it's something that to this day is like shocking to me that people don't know more about. I did not know more about. And it wasn't until I went through the experience and then was given information and research about this that I became aware of it. And I did a big series on my podcast about false confessions. So anyone who is curious, please, come to my website, amandaknox.com. I did a really huge deep dive into like the meticulous way that once you're in the interrogation room, the police will break down your own sanity and insert a new reality. It's frightening, and I think that's again the big reason why people sort of automatically reject it without actually thinking about it is we'd like to think that we're immune to that kind of thing when the reality is that we are very psychologically vulnerable when under duress.
Yeah, those episodes are really good, and I've listened to them, and I encourage people to check them out. Did you consider changing your name at any point?
Hmm. Um, No. Although someone in my position you know, I know people who have been through this experience like me, exonerees who have gone through something like this like me, maybe not as internationally globally vilified, but like on a local level vilified, like their own hometown, their own state, like everyone has turned against them and they feel like their identity has been irrevocably just destroyed. There is a temptation to change one's name and just to start over, just to be reborn and move on as if this never happened.
Right.
I resisted that for a couple of reasons. One, because in the same it felt like changing my name was admitting defeat in a way. It was like saying that there was something wrong with the Amanda Knox of it all, when there wasn't anything wrong with the Amanda Knox of it all. There was something wrong with the way that the world had treated Amanda Knox, and that was what the problem was. So there was a part of me that was like, no, I shall not admit defeat because it's not my it's not my fault. I'm not the problem. The other part of me realized that I didn't want to live my life as if this thing that was so tremendous and such a hugely big part of my development as a person didn't exist, right? Like there it's almost this it's both a blessing and a curse that the worst experience of my life is publicly known. Because then I don't have to feel awkward about introducing the fact that I have this horrifically traumatic experience that informs who I am as a person. Like people just
Right.
know that it's out there. I don't have to go through the trouble of explaining it. It does mean that people have certain ideas about me or prejudices or stereotypes or just thoughts about me that may not be true. So that's the bad side of it. But the good side of it is that I just have to accept that it is a part of who I am, and changing my name is not going to do anything to it's putting a band-aid on a cancer diagnosis. It's like,
Mm.
it doesn't actually help. So I have embraced the fact that this is a thing that happened to me and it informs me. It doesn't limit me. And I think that was the big shift that I try to talk about in Free My Search for Meaning is that realizing that even coming out of prison and even being, vindicated and freed and recognized as innocent didn't free me from the burden of being the girl who was accused of murder. Like that is my life now. And so, how do you find freedom within that limitation? And the way that I did that was by allowing myself to be informed by it, to be propelled by it, instead of held back and limited.
Were there people after the exoneration who sort of would privately say, "Listen, I'm not gonna say anything, but, like, did you do it? Like, I know you've been exonerated, and I get it. Listen, but you can tell me," sort of thing, or people that you perceived or told you, I actually think you did do it," or was that not something that took place?
No one's ever asked me, did you do it?" in private like that. But what I will say though is I've definitely had experiences where I have encountered a person in passing. We had a nice, very human exchange. And I thought that I got to be a normal person there for a second, but then I find out later that they went around telling their friends, "Oh my God, I met Amanda Knox and she could have killed me. Who knows?" And so
Oh.
there's that you know, I'm not being encountered like a regular person, and I'm not being received the way that I am intending to be received, which is
Hmm.
as a normal person who would just like to have a normal human exchange with another human being. I remain an idea of a person in other people's minds, and that idea is something that I cannot control.
Are sometimes there's the idea that if you go through something that's really difficult, it then in some way hardens or prepares you so that moderately difficult things that happen in the future don't seem that difficult, right?
Hmm.
Is there any sense that you feel now that you are better equipped to deal with the difficulties of everyday life because of what you went through? Or is it so distant, it was so far away, it was such a one off that it doesn't really translate in that way?
Mm. So, what I can say for me personally is that yes, the everyday things of life, even, really difficult everyday things of life that can seem catastrophic, when in comparison to what I have already experienced, do not seem catastrophic, right? Like I it which isn't to say that they are any less painful.
Mm,
Painful experiences are painful. But I think that the trick or the issue that we do in real life is that we add layers of pain, unnecessary pain on top of painful experiences,
hmm,
which are those unnecessarily painful things that we impose upon ourselves unnecessarily are things like my life shouldn't be this way, or you know thinking that life should be other than it is, basically. And like I have so accepted that life is painful sometimes that I don't get into this. I don't trick myself into suffering even more by thinking that I shouldn't be feeling pain right now. So I feel like that in that way it lessens it. That said, that said, it is not by definition that someone will go through a painful, a very extremely catastrophic experience and come out the other side being able to like deal with the minor catastrophes of life. It might be that that major catastrophe was so devastating and that person was not able to pick themselves up,
right.
that even the smallest of catastrophes are very triggering to them. So I don't want to take this stance that, hitting rock bottom is a good thing. Some people don't come back from really big catastrophes. And I think the thing that is the difference between someone who does and someone who doesn't is, first of all, a deep, deep knowledge that they matter or that they are loved. Like, if you don't feel like you really, truly matter or that you are really, truly loved by anyone, you do not recover from catastrophe. You don't. And if you're not able to shift in your perspective and see that something valuable can be obtained or gleaned from a painful experience, you're also going to struggle to pick yourself back up,
Mm.
because you're going to feel like you are just lessened by a painful experience. You've had something taken from you instead of you have been able to get something from even the experience of having something taken from you. If that makes any sense.
That makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. The newest book is free, My Search for Meaning. We've been speaking with the book's author and also the host of the Hard Knocks podcast, Amanda Knox. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you so much.